Welcome again to Following Historic Trails. Well, our guest this week is another one of those brave men that we found in the river. It's amazing the number of people you find in the middle of nowhere out on the river. Norman Briscoll. How do you do today, Norman?
Fine, thank you, Bruce.
I met Norman just as we were preparing for our great trip to Batoche last year. And now we're going to find out a little bit of background about you and find out how you got interested in the river. Maybe you could start about telling me where you're from originally.
Well, I was born in the north in the Peace River country, and up there's an awful lot of river boats, and they do an awful lot of freighting and passenger service on the Peace itself quite a few years back. And when I was real young, in my early teens, I got interested in boating and making boats and splicing rope and things like that, and waterproofing canvas, and I got acquainted with quite a few people in that sort of line and that field. And later on in years, in '72, when I moved back to Lethbridge, then I heard about this sternwheelers thing. And the opportunity didn't come up until I retired. Gad, it was exciting.
Well, before we get talking about the sternwheelers in this area, maybe I should ask you, did they have any contraption like a modern-day sternwheeler up in the Peace River area?
I just can't remember the year, but the D.A. Thomas used to travel the Peace River.
Now this is one of the real
old sternwheelers,
yeah.
Yes. And it was wood-fed, steam-driven, and 2 times a year they'd put on an excursion for the town people where you could go upstream with them, and the adults would work for a half a day filling in, cutting wood, bringing it into the boat, and that would give everybody a picnic upstream, and then we get back on the boat and come downstream. And the old D.A. Thomas used to haul grain, cattle, mail, everything on the Peace.
What year are we talking about now?
I would say in 30.
Around 1930.
Yeah,
This
a little bit, 28 to 30 in there.
This must have been a common thing because they had the same sort of thing up in Medicine Hat, down in Medicine Hat. Those boats, can't think of the man's name now, but it's the same fellow that took the boat later on to Saskatoon following the same route that we took, and then it hit the pillar at Saskatoon and sunk, and it's the great naval disaster of Saskatoon, you know. But anyway, at that time they used to run from Medicine Hat to Galt Island, where we started from, and back to Medicine Hat, sort of little excursions, picnics, and this type of thing. So I guess it was quite fun.
D.A. Thomas is owned by the Hudson Bay Company, and they use it for fur trade. And
it probably looked somewhat like the sternwheelers that were found all over the place.
This was a very good size. It would hold, I would say, maybe vehicles 4 wide and maybe 10 long on the main deck, you know. And it was.
But there was none of the sort of small little boats that we've developed in this area in the last few years.
No, not small sternwheelers, but many gas-driven boats, propeller.
What did? Well, that's what I was going to ask you. For recreational vehicles, did they use canoes or motorboats?
Motorboats,
same type of thing that we would find in a river or a lake.
River boats, yeah.
And they
use faster.
They use jet boats up there too, don't they?
I don't know now, but they didn't use jets then. They used outboards and inboards. Yeah.
I imagine some of our listeners probably have a little bit of trouble with a jet boat.
Yeah.
It is not like an airplane.
No.
But it forces water through the.
Yeah. At a great speed. And it's the force the water hitting the original waterbed that makes it speed ahead.
And they can really move. But they use a lot of gas. They don't need much water. But anyway, all right, so you're from the Peace River area, and you were mentioning, and we want to get as much history as we can here, but you were mentioning as a boy you plodded through places where some of the great explorers were. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
At Finley Forks, where Mackenzie, when he was looking for the Northwest Passage, Finley Forks is like the join of the Smoky and the Peace. There's a plateau in there where he winter camped. And there's a carom on the other side of the river to market because there's no roadway right to the thing itself. But when we would go hunting, we would and many times walk right over the same ground or near the campsite of where Mackenzie winter
Yeah.
camped.
Believe-
And
I
there's
believe Mackenzie was the first person to cross North America, north of Mexico.
Yeah.
You know.
And there's one place there that hunters use today that faces the south on the Smoky. It's called Mackenzie Lookout, and it's quite a barren piece of land, something like the edge of one of our coulees here, but very high. And hunters climb part way up and use scopes to spot their game below. And it's called Mackenzie Lookout.
Is that right? Yeah. How is the average person's feeling towards the river differ from what we think of the river down in this part of the country? I always get the impression around here that people ignore the river, other than a few weird people like ourselves.
I noticed that it isn't in the conversation much, only in the times like when we use it for sternwheelers or anything. But up there, it's a way of traveling. It's got an awful lot of interest all the way along it, and people use it a great deal more, the river itself, as a way of recreation. Last summer I was up there for a couple of weeks, and pretty near every day when you looked out on the water there was 4 or 5 boats, either going upstream or downstream or pulling a skier or something like this. It's used a great deal.
Mind you, our rivers here, there isn't many days of the year that it's got enough water for very big boats.
See, the piece is about, at a narrow spot would be maybe a half a mile wide.
Another thing that's rather intrigued me over the years is that the people in this area haven't built their homes overlooking the river. I mean, you have some fantastic views of the river in this area, and yet the homes are built, you know, obviously closer to the road, but they ignore the beautiful views. How is it the same up there?
No, up there all the riverbank on both sides are used a great deal, all different levels. Like my brother, he has a home. It's about, I would say, a quarter of a mile from the river, but it's on the west side of the piece, and he can see the town, the Gruard Hill that comes into the piece from our side of the, and it's got a beautiful view, and it's just entertaining because he hardly gets any shadow at all because he's out on a bit of a point, and it's just beautiful, and there are thousands of homes way up even on the top land, right at the edge. There's houses there, but the valley there is more sloped, like from Peace Town, where the town is, to the top of the thing is about, there's a drop of about approximately 2,200 feet. When we were young, we used to bobsleigh down there on the main roads, which was very illegal, of course.
I imagine that the weather is quite a bit different up there than it is here.
Yes.
Very long winters, eh?
You know, it seems like as if they get more winter than they do summer, but that's not quite true. But they're market gardening on the same side that my brother lives on. They raise cantaloupe, watermelon, everything. It's beautiful. There's quite a few famous, like Freeland and Early's, and there's quite a few market gardeners that were there for years and years and years. They just have abundance of berry bushes, everything.
Well, how did you get down into southern Alberta from the Peace?
Well, when I was, in my late teens, I moved to Edmonton, and I started working out there, and I was sort of enjoying the little milder weather than the milder winters than in the Peace, and I got sort of accustomed to the city, and then from there I came into Lethbridge the first time in 1955. And in fact, I opened the TV store on 3rd Avenue.
That's right, you were telling me that once.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the TV.
Well, that was House of Television. I brought here in November the 1st, 1955, before Channel 7 went on the air.
Was this sort of an offshoot of a Calgary firm?
No,
or
it was an offshoot of a Edmonton firm. I was a branch of an Edmonton firm. And they were having financial difficulties, and I come down in November and February. I bought the branch here. But not being a very smart operator, I didn't have it all on paper. And then they went bankrupt in June, and I lost everything.
Is that right?
So that ended up, I had to stay here until I cleared my name and cleared my debts.
Did you open up, did you stay in business, or
No, I couldn't.
you couldn't afford the business?
Everything was gone.
So,
I went back to my trade and got my name cleared, and then in '65 the government asked me to go to work for them, so I did.
in what department was
And
this?
I worked for the Attorney Generals in 1965 in Edmonton. I went back to Edmonton in '65. And worked
Okay,
for-
here's what many people I'm sure wonder. What is an Attorney General's department? Sounds very impressive, but what
Well,
is it?
That's the law enforcement part of the government.
Okay, and how,
And-
and what
and,
might they do?
Well, they take care of law enforcement, like the Crown prosecutors and so forth, all come under that. Law enforcement agencies come under that. Now it's divided up into the Solicitor General and the Attorney General's department. So the ones that aren't directly connected with court are under the Solicitor Generals.
Well, what was your background that made the people come
Well,
and say,
I'd been-
Norm, we need you in our
Well,
department?
What brought that on was I belonged to an organization, and I'd been volunteer then for about 12 years for this organization, which meant that sobriety was involved. And my experience, they thought, would be an advantage to work in the halfway house in Edmonton for these chaps coming out of jail from all the federal institutions and the provincial institutions. So I worked there for about 7.5 years. And then it was taken over by ADAC, Alberta Alcohol and Drug Abuse Commission. And I heard when it was being taken over by them that there would be an opening in Lethbridge. And I transferred to ADAC with the understanding that I would get the opening in Lethbridge. That's why I got back here in '73.
Oh, I see. By the way, as I look at you here, and I never noticed it before, and I went down the river with you, you look a bit like Tommy Douglas. Has anybody ever mentioned that to you before?
No, that's the first. Bruce.
Well, I met Tommy Douglas a few years ago in Victoria, and you know, just the way you were sitting there. Well, anyway, it's beside the point. Maybe that's why he got the position as the Attorney General. You never know. Okay, so you're back in Lethbridge, and then let's get on to the sternwheelers, and we can backtrack a little later
Okay.
as we maybe want to.
And then about this time, a year ago, it was a little earlier than this, it was a year ago November, I heard about the sternwheelers here. I heard a little bit on the air. I think it was one of your presentations on the air, and I read a little bit in the paper about it. And at the same time, we were getting a new pastor at a church, and I understood that he was at it for boating. So one day we were just talking, and I said, let's do it. And he said, okay. So we went to a sternwheelers meeting, and that's where I met you the first time.
Well, this is Father Steve you're talking
Yes.
about, I believe, and he had some boating
Oh, great.
background back in, was it Lake Ontario or one of the
Georgian Bay and around that area.
Georgian Bay?
Yeah, and
And
he's had some good boats, I guess.
what do you mean some good boats? Are you insinuating? I'm
Well-
defensive here, you see.
Well, what I meant was boats that were used to water. Is that better?
That's probably better. What you're saying, he was a real seaman.
That's right, a real
And knew what he was
enthusiast.
doing.
Yeah.
And all this type of stuff. Well, this must have been quite a, it's too bad we don't have him here to defend himself, but it must have been quite a shock to him to see these little boats. In fact, you went around, I think, to some of the people that had built some of these sternwheelers in
Yeah,
town.
him and I went around. And
To show him what these boats looked like, because he had never seen one. What was his reaction?
well, the one that we finally purchased was the first one that impressed him, but we'd seen about 3 before that, and it was quite interesting that, you know, it was sort of a scowl and a wonderment, and but very wise person as far as watercraft was concerned, and it was real interesting. And he's quite a tall man, and I'm quite short, and I think everybody looked up and down at us like this while we were talking, and that was another thing, because the expression on other people's face was pretty good. And we saw all the sternwheelers, well, not all of them, but quite a few of them that had been in the race the year before,
That's right.
or the trip the year
And so he didn't start to back off and say, hey, maybe we should do it with a canoe or something like that?
No, because water wasn't, the depth of the water wasn't on our mind then. It was getting transportation. We were all excited about it.
And you knew it was going to be a long way, so if you could get a motor there somewhere, that was the key. Eh? All right, so finally you decided to, and you went to these meetings where we backed off and we went forward and back and forth. And then finally the day, remember we did the test run, and it was not a very nice day.
Cold, miserable.
That's right, and did you wonder maybe...
Well, I think that was the thing that, in my mind, I thought, well, it's early weather. This could be the worst day we had. And it was true.
You're an optimist, right? An optimist.
Yeah, it was true. That was the worst day we had, outside of the time Vern and I got wet, but we didn't get cold.
Yeah, that's right. Mind you, on our way back, driving back, we went through a blizzard, so we were very...
Well, we were very fortunate to come through that blizzard without any slowdown, nothing. Nothing held us back. We were very fortunate. The best trip in the world. I wish I'd have done it 20 years earlier, when the water was higher.
Well, tell us, we've talked on this program before about the trip that we made when we carried all the mail and we went to Batoche, and I'm sure the people have had enough of that. But you went on a trip again in the summer, and this is the trip that you went with Father Steve. And
the last part of June, or the last day of June, we launched at Lethbridge, and our boat wasn't ready. The Stella Maris wasn't ready.
What do you mean by it wasn't ready?
It wasn't in the water. It wasn't...
this was the next day you're leaving, and it wasn't ready?
No, it wasn't ready.
Oh, what did you need?
So, well, there was some mechanical difficulties they were having with it, and there was nothing I could do about that, because all I can do is paint and do a little bit of carpenter work.
And make bologna sandwiches.
And cook, yeah.
Okay.
And so I waited, and they launched here, and a couple of days later, the Sunday, I went down to Medicine Hat because I knew it would be another week before our boat was ready. My family would come with me, and we drove down to Medicine Hat, and two of our people from Stella Maris come with me, two of the chaps who were going to travel with us. And we went to Medicine Hat, and we joined the party there, which had a great deal of difficulty through boats being damaged on low water and rocks and so forth, and losing quite a few of them. And we went overland from there because during my experience going through the rapids and so forth from Medicine Hat on, the water was even lower then than what you and I went through. So I knew that we couldn't get it, so we went to Sandy Point and re-entered there. Some of the boats did. The Catherine Stott entered there, and I think the Ruby Queen entered there for a little while, but then they come back on shore again. And then we followed the river the best we could with trailers and boats and vehicles, and we ended up in Saskatoon on the 8th, the 7th, the night of the 7th.
What was the reaction in Saskatoon?
Well, that was their ho-hum in the afternoon of the 7th. There was a boat on the river. That was just about as plain as I could put it.
Mind you, they have quite a few boats on their river there.
Yeah, but there was a strange boat on the river.
I see, okay.
And the next day was their Louis Riel Day. And there was a good crowd for that. But getting there was quite a few places getting to Saskatoon. Like there was quite a few places that got up and come to meet us. Like Elbow was one of them, and that was below Eston. Eston was one place that I remember real well because they met us with fanfare and just a crowd of people for this little tiny center. It was just great. And they had the mayor was there, and they wanted souvenirs, they wanted to buy caps, they wanted everything in the world. And the next morning they got up at 5:30 and made us a breakfast that included quiche, bacon and eggs, roast baked ham, scalloped potato, everything you could think of, so we could be away at 6. And there was all sorts of different experiences. Some places where we had to motor into their town. We were, when the fireworks went off on the 4th, or the 1st of July, we were in a town of Leader. And we'd all bedded down because we were just tired right out. That included about 18 people, or 15 to 18 people. It all depended on how many were on the river and how many were in the town. And these boats and trailers and so forth, and the fireworks started going off, so everybody had to get up. And the next morning it showed that because
You-
it's all in consuming labor and
That's
stress.
right. Yeah. You really get a real fanfare in some of these small towns
Oh, yeah.
that you miss in the city because there's so much activity going on, and they sort of lose you in
There
places.
was one retired gentleman in Leader that sort of become very acceptable to us. He was a real fine man, and he had a car, and he took us every place. Park your vehicles, I'll drive you. Where do you want to go? What do you want to know? A real source of information and contacts, and it was just great. And he warned the people downstream. He went home after we left and phoned the people downstream that we were coming and so forth. And it was just great. It was all sorts of things that, something like the experience in the post office in Saskatoon.
Mhm.
You know, those kind of things that are real exciting and made the trip worthwhile.
Where do you think these sternwheelers are going to go in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Anywhere? Did you get any interest from people saying, hey, that's kind of a neat idea, we should build one?
I believe that it'll get bigger, the group will get bigger, but the boats will get smaller. I think the boats will become more like scows, real flat bottom, made of wood, very shallow, sterns on them, not very deep.
Sort of like the one that, what's his name, from Rossiter built. I'm trying to think of the name, Shepherd's. I don't know if you remember that the first year.
No, I didn't.
I think it was about the cheapest one that was put together. It was flat.
Well, the Catherine Stott is a good example.
Oh, yeah.
There's a real good, and it traveled, I would say, 80% of the way between, of course, it traveled all the way from here to Medicine Hat, but 80% of the passage between Medicine Hat and Batoche. And that was excellent. Sometimes there's only 3 or 4 inches of water.
That's right. But it managed to make it.
Yeah, 80% of the trip.
Now, after hearing some of the horror stories of this trip, and you haven't really touched upon them,
No.
but, all the hype and so on, and then having to find out your boat's smashed up within 2 miles of whatever. I'm surprised that people are still interested, but they still seem to be all gung-ho. I hear they want to go down the Missouri River
Yes.
next year.
There's all sorts of, I didn't get to the last meeting, but there's talk about picking some other river, maybe the North Saskatchewan, maybe the Missouri, and the Milk River. They've even examined that, but of course the Milk is under irrigation control, and it's high and low.
Yeah.
And there's quite a few obstructions like bridges that you'd never pass under.
Well, I, of course, am partial to the Missouri because this is the area that is where the sternwheeler developed on.
Yes.
And I would recommend that to them as the foremost river to do, and it's very easy. It's easier than
I've
this
camped
river.
alongside the Missouri, and it's a good-sized river.
And it's got fantastic things to see as you go down the river. Good view. And North Saskatchewan would be ideal too. I mean, it has a great sternwheeler history. But I hope that it continues to grow and grow.
I'm sure it will, but it'll be smaller boats, shallow draft.
I'm surprised we didn't get more interest from the average person. There was still just a small core of people that got involved. Have you any explanation for this? Is it just too conservative a town for something?
Well, I sort of think the people have a tendency to sit back and wait. I think if we want a real drive on this thing, in the next month or two is when we should start on it and create, just like your history things in the paper, little things like that, just continually pecking away and build up the thing that way, because I'm sure that if people saw what you and I saw along the South Saskatchewan, you know, it just,
They say
it's unbelievable, the thousands of geese and deer and pelicans and wildlife of all description, beavers and muskrats, everything I think of.
That's right.
And beautiful scenery that very few people have even passed by.
That's right. Well, I hope that it continues to grow. I'm I was more interested in the historical aspect, and I'm not a builder. If I built one of those boats, I mean, it would only go 3 feet. So, and maybe this is a problem that most people have, is that there are a limited number of expertise in how to put a boat together. This may be a problem.
Well, I think the first few years, I think everybody had a glorious idea that it had to have a keel, it had to have a round bottom, and all sorts of things.
Mhm.
But river boats, I think, in the beginning were made very plain, very ordinary, and very simple.
Yeah, the original boats on the Missouri were
Just made
flat
of planks.
bottoms.
Yep.
In fact, they would cut the things, making them into planks, put the planks together. When they got downstream, they would sell the things for sidewalks. Now,
Yep.
there's a problem here. You can't take these boats apart and sell them for sidewalks anymore.
That's
But maybe there's something else they could sell them for.
Yeah, but it was just amazing how simple. I've seen hundreds of scows made when I was a young man, and they just put a 2x6 crossways on edge, 3 or 4 in a row, maybe 3 or 4 feet apart, and just plank it in, and then chink the joints,
Mhm.
turn it upside down in the water, and it'll float. And from there on, maybe the wall, the outside wall, would be 18 inches to 2 feet high, and they'd fill it full of grain and stock and everything else.
Yeah. Well, Norman, I'm glad I went on the boat because I met you. I never knew you before, and it's amazing the people that you met from this little escapade we had.
It's exciting, isn't it? And
Yeah.
all the fun we had, all the little different experiences, meeting you, meeting Vern and Riel, and having to share part of Francis's life, I think that was wonderful.
Mhm.
And Francis's life must have been built just around our trip.
Now, for the listeners, we're talking about Francis Crook, who was one of our mates and died just
Our engineer.
and died just a few months ago. In fact, he was sick at the time that he went. We knew he was sick, and but he wanted to go. We were surprised that he, wanted to go through the ordeal. But I think it's safe to say that this was one of the highlights of his life, as
Yes.
Was
And
mentioned.
he made it one of our highlights too, didn't he?
Yeah. Well,
Fine.
thanks again, Norman, for coming. And we always give away one of these books to our listeners. And so I'm going to ask them a question, and you're going to know the answer, but don't tell me. And if they get the answer and they're the first person to phone in, they get a copy of the Lethbridge 100th Anniversary Plan Book, which, by the way, is not limited to the 100th anniversary because it's full of all kinds of quiz questions about southern Alberta. The one mistake we made is we gave it the wrong name because people think it's dated. And, of course, the information in it is not dated. So we hope that they like the book, and if they win the question, they will get the copy. The question is, tell me the name of the famous explorer that lived next to Norman Briscoll, for a while anyway, up in the Peace River country. And if you think you know, phone the station, and if you're correct and you're the first one, you get a copy of this book. And thanks again, Norman, for coming and sharing your experiences with us. And until next week, remember to follow some historic trails.